Hey everyone, and welcome back. So today I'm going to talk about how the education system has been hijacked, how it gives us different inlines into university that don't work out the way they used to, how the way that we mark, the way that we interpret has changed, and the results that gives us in society. Where we're going from here isn't necessarily smooth riding. UK universities are going bust. Around 1 in 5 of them are now in serious financial difficulty. Nottingham is the latest high-profile example, cutting staff, closing courses, facing strikes, and the instinct for a lot of people is to shrug. Degrees aren't worth what they were. Everyone knows that. Maybe this is just the market correcting itself. I don't think it's that simple, and I think the shrug is exactly the response that got us there. Because what's happening to universities financially isn't separate from what's happened to them academically. They're the same story, and that story starts back in 2010. When the Conservatives returned to government, they brought a very specific idea with them about what education was for. Not personal development, not critical thinking, not the formation of someone who could engage meaningfully with the world around them. Education under this framework existed solely to generate an economic return for the students as an individual and for the country as a whole. That was it. That was the entire justification. Michael Gove, as Education Secretary, made this explicit. Learning was about creating economic value. Universities existed to enhance earning power. And everything that didn't fit that framework, the arts, the humanities, the slower and less measurable kinds of intellectual formation, but quietly deprioritized or cut. The consequences of that were always going to land somewhere. They're landing now. Once you define education as a market transaction, students become consumers and universities become suppliers. And once that logic is in place, everything else follows. Universities had to behave like businesses. They needed recruitment targets, revenue streams, growth strategies. They became dependent on overseas students. They started selling postgraduate programs primarily as income generators. And because growth was a financial necessity, it was matched by austerity in the actual delivery of education. Too few staff, too little contact time, too little marking, and grade inflation as a marketing tool rather than a reflection of genuine achievement. And here's the thing about a model built on those foundations. It was always going to fail. Not because of bad luck or external shocks, but because it was structurally incoherent from the start. You can't simultaneously lower standards to drive recruitment and maintain the credibility that gives the credentials its value. Eventually, the market you've built turns on you because the product stops delivering what it promised. Students can see it, employers can see it. I've seen research showing that employers are increasingly bypassing traditional degree classifications entirely and retesting applicants themselves because they've concluded that the grades don't tell them anything reliable anymore. When that happens, the signal has broken down. The qualification is not doing the thing it exists to do. The financial crisis and the credential crisis are both symptoms. The deeper problem is what happened to the actual content of education long before the money ran out. One of the things that becomes very clear when you look at how educational thinking has developed over the last 2 decades is that critical thinking, the ability to construct an argument, to interrogate evidence, to hold a position and defend it against a counter-argument, has been systematically squeezed out at every level. Schools first, universities are now inheriting the consequences. Students arrive at university having been through a system almost entirely orientated around testing. Do you know it or don't you? That is genuinely the only question the system asks. Memorization, reproduction of approved answers, performance in controlled conditions. and independent appraisal of evidence, of arguments, of your own thinking has largely been removed. The result is that many students reach university without the foundational skills that university used to be able to assume. They can't write an essay in a way that an essay is supposed to work, not because they're not capable of it, but because nobody has ever asked them to do it before. They can't construct a counter-argument. They can't build a narrative through a piece of work, weave evidence and argument together and arrive at a conclusion that's been earnt rather than simply asserted. These aren't exotic academic skills, they're basic tools of thought. An entire cohort arrived without them because the system before university never acquired them. Don't blame the students for that. This was designed. A system orientated entirely around testing and reproduction produces people who can be tested and who can reproduce. It produces people who are less well equipped to question, to challenge, to think for themselves. And whether that was a deliberate objective or simply an inevitable consequence of the framework, the outcome is the same. So what would actually help? I'd argue it starts with being honest about what education is for, not economic return, not credential production. Education should be developing people who can think, communicate and engage with the world around them. Those things have value that isn't captured by earnings data, and pretending otherwise is how we ended up here. Communication, in particular, is the skill that's most visibly absent and most consistently undervalued. The ability to speak clearly about an idea, to write coherently, not in some narrow technical sense, but in the sense of being able to convey what you actually mean to the person reading it. Engage numerically with the world in a way that's meaningful rather than mechanical. These matter across every domain of life, not just academic ones. And they're developed through practice, through feedback, through being expected to construct something and then defend it. That's not a complicated model. It's actually quite an old one. The problem is that it doesn't lend itself to standardized testing. And a system built around standardized testing has no obvious place for it. The financial crisis in universities is real, and it will have real consequences for the communities that host them. But fixing the money without fixing the model just prolongs a system that was already failing the people it was supposed to serve. The two problems need to be addressed together, and they need to be addressed from the first principles about what education is actually meant to do. Because right now, the honest answer to that question is nobody in charge seems entirely sure.